Okay, make sure we're live on YouTube.
You want me to retweet this or something right now?
Yeah, I'll tell you when it's live. Cool, we're live. And Status Coup Nation, delighted to be joined by Abby Martin of the Empire Files, who has done amazing work over the years and similar to us, has kind of been blacklisted by corporate media, which should be a badge of honor. How are you doing during these pandemic times, Abby?
Hanging in there, Jordan. Thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. It's great to be on Status Coup finally. Love the show and love what you guys are doing.
Yeah, and we had a good time. We were on your podcast a couple of weeks ago. So obviously a lot of people, it's kind of hard to keep up with the news cycle because it's just chaos in 2020. But before COVID, you were set to speak at Georgia State University. And essentially, I mean, my understanding of it was asked to sign like a foreign loyalty pledge to Israel. And if you didn't, you would be disinvited. So can you, for people that know nothing about what happened, can you explain what happened in February, your corresponding lawsuit, and now there's obviously an update with the lawsuit?
Yeah, so 28 states or so, and maybe more now, have these laws on the books, which is essentially for private contractors. So me as an independent contractor going and speaking at Georgia Southern University, that would be the same, let's say, as a construction worker. I know that these existed in Texas for hurricane relief funds, that you had to sign over a loyalty pledge to Israel in order to get funds and in order to work in the state of Texas. So it didn't matter if I was a substitute teacher or an independent contractor in construction, or in my case, speaking at a university. Ironically, Jordan, this was a conference for media literacy. It had nothing to do with Palestine. It had nothing to do with my pro-Palestine advocacy or my film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. I was simply to discuss the topic of media literacy. So it's just a hilarious kind of chain of events that in order to speak there, I was given this contract to say, I pledge that I will not boycott Israel now or at any point in my life in order to get the $1,000 honorarium that I had, that I was going to receive for speaking there. So of course, getting this contract, and I knew that these laws existed in the periphery. I had spoken about them on tour for our film, but to actually receive the contract myself was pretty shocking. I did not know that that was going to happen. So of course I said that I could not sign this. I knew that it was a direct violation of my constitutional rights, namely my First Amendment right of free speech and the right to participate in political boycotts. This is something that was granted by the Supreme Court back in the 80s on the heels of the civil rights movement. So, you know, I couldn't comply with the request to say that I could never boycott Israel. I've been advocating the boycott of Israel for my entire journalistic career. So yeah, Jordan, I declined that contract. The entire conference ended up falling apart because in the background, the organizers were arguing amongst themselves, and some had taken my side and they said, we don't want to go through with this if you're going to knock Abby off as the keynote speaker because she refuses to sign this pledge. So the entire conference fell apart. There was actually a notice on the website saying this is canceled until further notice. And once I told my story, I was contacted by CARE about the initiation of a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. These laws have been challenged in, I think, 3 states, and there have been different outcomes for each one. It might go to the Supreme Court. It depends on what the outcome is, but I decided to legally challenge this back in March. We had a big press conference in Georgia with CARE and my other attorney from the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, Marv Hayden Hilliard. Amazing attorneys. I'm so thankful that they're representing me. And I think we have a really good case because this is a flagrant violation of the US Constitution. And you even have Netanyahu and Israeli consulate, Israeli government officials admitting openly that they have, in a direct, blatant act of foreign interference, Jordan, as we're hearing liberals bemoan about Russia constantly, in a direct act of foreign interference, you have Israeli government officials admitting that they have been responsible for pushing these laws across the country. So that's where we're at right now. And I could talk about what has happened lately, which is why this case is now relevant again, which is right before the pandemic hit. Because I initiated this lawsuit, Georgia state legislature officials actually brought an Israeli government official to the state legislature and talked to them about crushing my case, which is trying to take the $1,000 honorarium, which would have triggered this contract to any state contractors or independent contractors working in the state, to now upping it to $100,000 to basically make the case moot and make it much more difficult for people to challenge the law. Because if you're making a $100,000 contract, you're much less likely to say, okay, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna forfeit this money because of my, because it's a violation of my constitution and my political free speech. So it's just outrageous that these laws are on the books. I think Americans would be really, really shocked to learn that these laws exist, especially when we hear so much nonsense about, again, foreign interference that really just comes down to something like Facebook ads, when you literally have government officials pushing laws, threatening economic consequences if we don't comply to loyalty oaths for their countries.
And what I find really interesting is, we know like DC, APAC, on the national level, Israel has always had a stranglehold over our national politics. But the fact that this is now spreading to local areas and states, it's like, I don't know, first thing I think about with Georgia isn't like hardcore love for Zionism and Israel. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of give insight in why has the kind of federal stranglehold that Israel has through AIPAC and other, why is it spread to the point where Georgia and these other states would be basically trying to, suppress dissent?
Yeah, and for just as a thought experiment, just like think about literally any other country doing this, right? Bringing, let's say, like a Russian or Iranian government official, or even like a Canadian official to your state legislature, being like, hey, we're working with this government to actually try to push these laws through. Like, they've asked us to do this, so that this is what we're going to do. I mean, it's just absolutely surreal and Orwellian, frankly, to kind of take yourself out of the scenario and really replace Israel with any other country. And I think it just speaks to this bizarre alliance and allegiance that has been bipartisan, right? And even Joe Biden himself said that if Israel didn't exist, the U.S. would have to create one, essentially as the U.S. empire's battering ram and gas station in the country when it's carrying out military operations. So it's fascinating that this has been able to happen. As to your question about how has this happened on a state-by-state level, Netanyahu himself said that they have been working locally. I mean, this is an effort to work locally, especially in light of the Trump administration's efforts to suppress pro-Palestine speech on college campuses, because they understand the threat that BDS poses on a local level. This is something that's erupting on college campuses across the country. And this is obviously the biggest threat to Israel on an international level, this international pressure that is mounting around the world, really, to hold Israel accountable for its crimes and atrocities against the Palestinian people. So it erupts on college campuses here. You see a lot of divestment efforts on college campuses here that are successful, frankly, and are causing waves. And that is scaring the Israeli government. And you saw the Trump administration take power, and they had been the biggest friend to Israel that Israel has ever had. You said Netanyahu campaigning on, basically his friendship with Trump. Trump's son, Jared Kushner, profiting personally on his illegal settlement expansion. They even have a house where a room is dedicated to Netanyahu when he comes to visit them. So it's pretty crazy stuff. But that's where you saw this kind of forging partnership where they really zeroed in on these college campuses. And that's where, Trump himself talked about this attempt. I'm not sure if it was an executive order or not, but he has talked about this a lot, and I'm pretty sure that he passed some sort of legislation that essentially says that if you're going to boycott Israel or initiate some sort of BDS movement, like you will forfeit like your potential job prospects and stuff. It's defaming college students and pro-Palestine activists in a really malicious way. So this has been something that they have been working together. And I think that you've seen these states pass these anti-BDS resolutions more frequently in the wake of the Trump administration. But I think going state to state is an obvious it's an obvious way to just kind of slip this by, because they all frame this, Jordan, in kind of anti-Semitism and hate speech and stuff like that. And I think a lot of these people just don't think twice about it. Like in the case of the Georgia law, I mean, it seemed like they didn't even understand how absurd it was. They were just talking about bringing an Israeli consulate official with them to, change the law, so make my case moot. I think they honestly just don't think twice. And because they framed it in this language of hate against Jewish people, frankly, it's really muddied the issue and made people not really aware of what a violation it really is and how it really is a notion of free speech. And that's why you see actually Jewish organizations like Trua, an organization of rabbis, and also J Street, which is a very, very influential lobbying organization on the Hill. They have actually signed amicus briefs filed on behalf of support for my lawsuit, because they understand that even if they don't support BDS, right, as a concept, they understand what a direct violation of BDS, anti-BDS laws rather, are on our free speech rights.
And I'll also say, I'd love to get your thoughts. Maybe you have insight into it, but like you said, you were set to speak at a media conference. This wasn't about Israel. You're somebody who's reported extensively in Gaza. You've done this great documentary. So to me, I don't know, it seems like someone like you with a big following would be on the Israeli government's radar. So I don't know. It just seems odd to me that you're going to speak at a conference about media and all of a sudden this foreign loyalty oath comes out. Do you have any insight whether, I mean, hopefully they're not monitoring you at all times, but that Netanyahu's government, his press operation, whatever, was tipped off to the fact that, you were speaking and that's why they reached out?
I know that I'm on their radar. That's been back since Operation Pillar of Cloud when I was at RT, that they took notice of my coverage and said RT had taken a side in the Gaza massacre that they were employing at the time, after they bombed a journalist tower, the Al Sharoof journalist tower, and blew an RT journalist's leg off. So back then they already had taken notice of my coverage. And then of course it got more extreme when we were in the West Bank doing reporting for Empire Files, and we tried to get into Gaza. And we were told by Israeli's press ministry that I was a propagandist and also an Iranian enemy agent. I was surprised to be called an Iranian agent. I'm used to being called a Russian agent or a Venezuelan agent. So that was frankly startling and scary, to be within Israel proper and actually be deemed like an enemy agent of Israel. I don't think I'll be welcomed back in the country. But as far as this clause, Jordan, that's what's so fascinating about it. It is triggered simply if anyone wants to work in the state of Georgia and has signed a contract for over $1,000. And I think that the vast majority of people are just forfeiting their constitutional rights to work, right? And without really thinking twice about it. And the only reason that I obviously took notice of it is because I was aware of these laws and, read the contract, read the language, and I was totally startled and taken back this language was included, and simply a clause in the overall contract of me signing to speak, right? It wasn't a separate contract that said, here, by the way, here's your loyalty pledge. So I could see how people would completely pass over this without giving it a second thought. And in fact, the majority of people do when they work not only in this state, but like I said, 27 states across the country. And the lobby, or not just AIPAC, but a lot of these lobbying institutions on behalf of Israel and a lot of Israeli officials clearly are lobbying other states because they want this mandated across the entire country, Jordan. They want these laws in place to basically put fear in people's minds, right? This is almost like a silencing of dissent so that you will be afraid to boycott Israel in the future. Times are tough right now. The pandemic has taken hold. A lot of people have lost their jobs. And so they want you to be, sign away this, your right to boycott Israel. And then in the future, if you have a strong political feeling about it, you might just think twice and say, well, I signed this contract a long time ago and I probably shouldn't say anything. So it's almost like a suppression tactic in the future, and to basically threaten like retroactive prosecution. Yeah, so that's what's going on. And the Zionist Organization of America is also involved in lobbying a lot of congressional constituents about legislation like these, and also the suppression of BDS activism on campus.
And also, whether you are for BDS or not, the whole American narrative about Israel is it's our sole democratic ally in the Middle East. It's a democracy in the Middle East. Well, it's kind of contrary to democracy to make people sign loyalty oaths, suppress their, First Amendment right, freedom of speech in order to be paid. I mean, what if you were a popular Palestinian journalist speaking at a conference? Did you have to sign a loyalty oath? Should that Palestinian author have to sign a loyalty oath to Israel in Georgia and these other states? So it's just completely contradictory, not just to the First Amendment here, but to this narrative that Israel is a democracy.
Absolutely. And what's funny about law is that in Georgia, you could actually boycott Georgian products. You can actually boycott U.S. products, U.S. companies. But for some reason, because of this law, you cannot boycott Israeli companies or products. It is absolutely stunning and surreal. Like I said before, I mean, this is a direct undermining of our democratic rights and freedom that we are told that are so cherished in this country, right? And that's what's so fascinating about the fact that state legislatures are just passing these kind of flippantly, right? And directly undermining our so-called rights that they like swear an oath on the Constitution to even take office. It's like, how is this even happening? And the fact that judges, like you mentioned, a Palestinian author or speaker, I mean, this has happened in Texas. A Palestinian woman who was a speech pathologist refused to sign the loyalty pledge as well, and she sued the state. You've had one judge uphold the law, one judge changed the cap, just like they're trying to do with mine, to $100,000 and made the case moot. And another judge actually deemed it unconstitutional. So because of the different decrees in these different states, you really could see something like this go to the Supreme Court. And I think it really has to. And I think that, even though the Supreme Court's stacked with Trump justices, it is such an obvious ruling, right? I mean, anyone who understands your First Amendment and understands that in past years, the Supreme Court has actually recognized the importance of political boycotts. You can look at, apartheid South Africa, for example. That's what brought down apartheid, was the international boycott movement against that country. So this has already been upheld. This has already been declared as part of our sacred First Amendment rights. And of course, free speech. I mean, we have the right to speak on whatever issues that we want. And I think you and I can agree for the most part on the importance of free speech. And if you don't like certain speech, then you need to combat that speech with other speech. It's really like, you can't just believe in free speech for some and not for others. So that's what's so also funny about this, is that there's this thing called the Campus Free Speech Act that has been passed by right-wing billionaire institutions like the Heritage Foundation in states like Georgia, that essentially like uphold the free speech rights of people like Milo Yiannopoulos. We hear like all this kind of conservative martyrdom about people who are losing their free speech rights on campus because they get heckled and protested against. Well, there was this act passed, ironically in Georgia, once again, that says that people who are espousing hateful reactionary speech will be protected from people who oppose that speech. Yet you see this anti-BDS law that essentially overrides that in the case of my speaking engagement, right? Where I was supposed to just speak on a media literacy topic, not even Palestine. But because of this anti-BDS law, I couldn't speak at all. So very, very telling, Jordan, of just how insane, right? That this relationship is with Israel, how Israel is just completely unaccountable. And because of our billions of dollars of funding of this apartheid state, it is just remains it's isolated in the rest of the world, right? The rest of the world, I think, has come to their senses that they need to hold Israel accountable. But because of the U.S. empire's shrouding and funding, continuation of funding for Israel, it will just remain unaccountable and continue to work with our government to essentially suppress the rights of Palestinian people. And that's what this comes down to. It's such a threat, right? That pro-Palestine activism and pro-Palestine speech is such a threat, that's what essentially needs to be shut down. And one more thing, we're seeing corporations do this as well. We just saw a Palestinian resistance fighter, Leila Khalid, actually have her lecture shut down on Zoom. This is someone who was very popular and is still very popular, but she was a really, really important figure during the Intifada. And she was just simply giving a lecture at a university, and Zoom actually shut down the talk because of who she was. So just bizarre all across the board, and really just such a double standard when you see actual war criminals, paraded around, not only from Israel, but of course the US government, and no corporations will take that stand when it comes to them.
That's a good segue to, contrary to Rudy Giuliani and the rest of the crackpots, Joe Biden will be president. He is rumored or reported to be appointing Susan Rice, Michelle Flournoy, not exactly, champions of Palestine, these people. Biden, kind of your cardboard cutout, Chamber of Commerce Democrat, who, to me, it will be status quo as far as, platitudes about a two-state solution, but basically allowing Israel to do whatever it wants. You obviously are an expert on foreign policy and these figures' background. What should people expect, not just from Biden, but the people he's going to put in his cabinet?
Well, one important thing was from In These Times, Sarah Lazar talked about how 1/3 of Biden's Pentagon transition team hails from think tanks and organizations that are essentially financed by the weapons industry. So you have think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, which employs several people that are part of Biden's DoD agency review team, and those are directly funded by corporations like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. Also receive money from countries like the UAE, which is bombing the shit out of Yemen and exacerbating that genocide right there. And Trump actually just oversaw a huge weapons shipment to the UAE, exacerbating the death toll in Yemen. Then you have two individuals that are part of the CNAS, the Center for New American Security. This is a think tank that essentially you can thank this think tank for the last 10 to 15 years of foreign policy under the Democratic administration of Barack Obama. This was a very, very influential think tank. This is where Michelle Flournoy is connected to. She's touted as the first woman, right, to run the Pentagon. And that's what you see, I think, with a lot of Biden's transition team so far and a lot of these potential picks. It's like Susan Rice, the first Black woman to potentially be in this role. And it's like when you go past these kind of rhetorical platitudes, and not just rhetorical platitudes. I mean, these are hugely symbolic, of course, for people of color to take positions of power. But when you go past these, when you go past the symbolism, it really is just the same bipartisan imperialism and policy of U.S. empire, right? That's subjugating tens of millions of people around the world. And in fact, the people that he's positioning for these roles are the worst of the worst, not to use a Bush administration term, but really, really horrific people here that are just the most hawkish foreign policy grunts in Washington. Let's take a look at Michelle Flournoy, for example. What's really, really bizarre about her, she's been in the foreign policy establishment blob for a very long time, going back to May of 1997 when she was serving under President Clinton as an assistant secretary of defense. She drafted something called the Quadrennial Defense Review, which essentially laid the ideological foundation of endless war. Very, very interesting here. This is a precursor to the AUMF. The AUMF is used, of course, from the Bush administration and beyond to root out Al-Qaeda and, engage in any sort of military combat anywhere at any time with no international approval, right? This is just a unilateral deployment of U.S. military power. And she coined this thing called a defense strategy on the QDR that essentially said this. It said, quote, when the interests at stake are vital, we should do whatever it takes to defend them, including the unilateral use of military power. Mind you, 4 years before 9/11. She said, Vital interests include, quote, preventing the emergence of a hostile regional coalition anywhere on Earth and, quote, ensuring uninhabited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Like, really, really crazy, right? That she's basically saying we have the right and duty as the US empire to just take any any resources available on the planet. And this was before 9/11. This is like unbelievable hawkishness. So yeah, I mean, it goes on and on. She helped craft Obama's endless Afghanistan war strategy, just every like horrible foreign policy blunder under his administration, Libya, Syria. She was right there helping draft these policy. And she's also like on the board of Booz Allen, which is a huge consulting firm. And she's just been going in and out of this revolving door of the contractor circuit for quite some time, just securing millions of dollars in military contracts. But yeah, I mean, the CNAS is a really, really bad think tank. You have Secretary of State Susan Rice, which is being floated as Secretary of State, like I said, the first Black woman, and so everyone's touting her as that. But really, like, she is a horrible war hawk, and this is going back again toward Clinton. She was in charge of Africa policy for Clinton. She defended brutal dictators across Africa, like the dictator who was overseeing the Rwandan genocide, Paul Kagame. And she also infamously, people blame Clinton for bombing that pharmaceutical company in Sudan as a retaliation for the embassy bombing going back to the bin Laden strategy under Bill Clinton. And she actually oversaw that strike that destroyed a pharmaceutical company that had no connection to the attack. So that was one of the infamous war crimes under Clinton that I actually didn't realize that she was responsible for until doing some research about her. But it's like the worst of the worst, Jordan. I mean, she's talking about, you go back to her defending Colin Powell, talking about WMDs, saying he clearly, made a clear-cut case for Saddam having WMDs, completely adamant about how we should preemptively attack Iraq. She was one of the leading advocates for imperialist intervention in Libya and Syria, and also, again, a staunch defender of Zionism and Israel's war crimes. I mean, she was actually seen in the UN, the international body under Obama, as like one of the staunchest defenders of Israel, and just constantly defended every single massacre that they were engaging in Palestine. She also like infamously drove that wedge between the US, Russia, Syria, the whole Assad chemical weapon stuff under Obama's tenure. And amazingly enough, she was very, very close to Obama, involved in the Terror Tuesdays, where he would pick out who to assassinate via drone week to week. So pretty much every single horrible foreign policy, thing that Obama was doing, she was right there every step of the way, giving advice to. And she has Joe Biden's ear. They've been friends for a very, very long time. She's also heavily invested in like fossil fuels, the Keystone XL pipeline, Trans-Canada. She's worth tens of millions of dollars. So I think that it just, her with Michelle Flournoy and plus all of these think tanks that are involved in his Pentagon transition team just really goes to show you what his foreign policy will be like. And it is so far right that it's just a slap in the face to the Bernie Sanders coalition. Again, like, he ran on this repudiation of Bernie Sanders. So it's just, again, just so offensive to the base that rallied behind him to, oust the fascists from the White House. And so it's just, I think it just is really demoralizing for people who want to move Biden left, who want to, keep pushing that coalition to try to employ a more humane, responsible foreign policy. And again, defunding the Pentagon, which we're spending $2 billion a day to subjugate and oppress tens of millions of people around the world when we're told we can't have Medicare for all.
Right. And with Biden, I mean, he has a history. I think Bernie didn't go after him hard enough, frankly. It's not only that he voted for Iraq, he was cheerleading for Iraq when it was already clearly a mess. I mean, years after the war was launched, he was still publicly supporting it. But the thing is, he, as far as I know, he hasn't said anything about his stance on Afghanistan. We're headed 20 years there. Bernie Rokana did a bipartisan bill. First time the War Powers Act was ever used to end U.S. involvement in Yemen. Trump obviously vetoed it. I haven't heard anything from Biden on whether he would honor that bipartisan the passing of the War Powers Act. And we know, frankly, I mean, he's about to step into a shit show economically. And what has the U.S. done historically? If they need a little economic boost, that would be war. So what are your thoughts on specifically Afghanistan, Yemen, and other hotspots? Because to me, he's been kind of vague on what he would do and what wars he would end versus, quote, drawing down troops.
Yeah, so Biden has been asked about Afghanistan once in the debates because he was VP when Obama oversaw that massive troop surge, which was a horrible, futile effort to, I don't know, win the war and really just caused, a ridiculous amount of deaths and just prolonged the already endless war. And he just kind of stuttered and stammered his way through that answer. He didn't even know what she was talking about at first. He was like, Afghanistan? Like, is that what you're talking about? It's like, yeah, dude, fucking Afghanistan. Like, what are you talking about? It was on the heels of the Afghanistan papers that basically just documented 20 years of Pentagon blunders where you had general after general passing off the war to the next administration and just saying the same exact rhetoric, that the end was in sight, and you've just been hearing the same line. So Biden also was challenged about it, I think in a 60 Minutes interview recently, where he said he would leave thousands of troops on the ground, essentially exactly what Trump has done. Trump, after all of this posturing as this anti-war populist candidate, at the end of the day, he's only withdrawn 5,000 troops over his entire tenure of the last 4 years. When he got into office, he inherited 8,500 troops from the Obama administration. He immediately doubled that to 14,000, as well as nearly quadrupled drone strikes, doubled civilian casualties, made fatalities of not only Afghan people, but U.S. soldiers at an all-time high for many, many years, I think since the U.S. invasion. And so we saw horrible bloodletting under the Trump administration when he first took office. And of course, the use of the largest non-nuclear bomb ever to be dropped, the Moab, the mother of all bombs, basically a tribute to the mother of all cities, right? Mecca, really offensive to Muslim people. You had his generals saying we're not going to waste our time digging through rubble to count dead bodies to find out how many people actually died from dropping that Moab bomb, which had a blast radius of 1 mile. He said he took the gloves off for the Pentagon. He essentially gave them carte blanche to do what they wanted. And we saw the effects of that. And actually, we saw more of a lack of transparency under Trump than ever before, where we actually don't know how many people are dying from drones and bombings now. But Joe Biden was directly asked, and he said thousands of troops, and this is like alongside thousands of special contractors, right? Special ops soldiers, drone bases, civilian contractors, private mercenaries, which we already knew Trump increased 65% when he got into Afghanistan, when he oversaw policy in Afghanistan, when he got into office. And that actually consists of more than half of the troops on the ground are private mercenaries who are completely unaccountable, and we don't know if they're staying. So everyone gives Trump credit. Everyone thought, oh my God, that, all this Pentagon shakeup that just happened where he fired Mark Esper, and everyone just kind of like bent over backwards to excuse his inaction for the past 4 years and be like, finally, he's going to end the war, right? Well, really, it just meant nothing. We ended up seeing really quickly what that was, and it was him probably trying to consolidate power at the very end of his administration, and it really meant nothing. I mean, Trump talks a big game. He keeps tweeting out empty platitudes that pretend to be anti-war, and at the end of the day, he has final authority over all troop withdrawals. Trump could have ended the war on day one. He made enough executive orders to basically do whatever he wanted at the beginning, right? He could have at least said, and bring the troops home. The Pentagon is subservient to him. He did nothing. He did nothing at all. And so I just don't understand why so many people like excused him, right? And actually pretended that Trump was anti-war. And unfortunately, Biden made it really easy because he was fighting Trump from the right a lot of the times. During the debate, he actually fought Trump from the right on punishing North Korea and China. You saw him running ads saying Trump was actually a China puppet.
Mhm.
Like it's just absolutely bizarre. But yeah, I think when in Afghanistan, we're going to see the exact same thing. But the problem with leaving troops in Afghanistan, which Trump is going to ultimately leave 2,500 troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq, is that Biden could ramp that up again. and just like Trump did when he took office. So that's the problem with leaving troops anywhere, is that the next administration could ramp it up and just continue the policy. So it's kicking the can down the road for the next administration and just doing nothing with it, after leaving a trail of blood and bodies in their wake. Biden on Yemen actually has said that he would try to end the US involvement in Yemen. Like you said, Trump vetoed that resolution. So that could be one other thing that Biden does that's different than the Trump administration. But you see just extreme hawkishness when it comes to Russia. You see Kamala repeating that bizarre trope that we're not going to write love letters to dictators, as if just having policy discussions with other foreign leaders is something like horrific, right? So it's again like who we're told is our enemy and who we're told is our friend. And Trump went against that when he, dared to sit down with Kim Jong-un, which is, I think, one of the only good things he literally did in his presidency. But the fact that Biden is fighting him on that, I think, is a bad sign. However, when it comes to Latin America, that's a whole other story because you have so many similarities. I think the only difference there would be Cuba, hopefully renormalizing relations with Cuba, which we saw under Obama as well, that I hope Biden does. So, the coup in Venezuela, we already know Biden supports Trump on that. You saw Chris Murphy and other Democrats saying they supported the coup attempt. It was just that Trump didn't do it savvy enough, that he was blundering, and so it's just disgusting, Jordan. And you haven't seen Biden actually address any of the ramping up of militarism that Trump has done, or the sanctions, the genocidal implementation of sanctions around the world that have killed 40,000 Venezuelans since 2017, and the sanctions on Iran, which is another big difference. I hope that Biden re-implements the Iranian nuclear deal and lifts those 800 plus sanctions that Trump put on Iran, because they are suffocating the country and they're asphyxiating the economy. And then again, I mean, Iran has no reason to trust the U.S. Look at what the U.S. has done, and look at Trump put us on the doorstep of war with Iran with the assassination of General Soleimani. So I hope that Iran takes another chance and re-implements that nuclear deal, and we can lift the sanctions, because that would be probably the best change. And that's why I hoped Biden won, is because I really hope that we would have that we would ease those tensions with Iran first and foremost, because that is really scary. Because if Trump were to win a second term, I really think that we would have gone to a war with Iran.
And I'd love to know what you think, because I got to tell you, all of a sudden, I'm hearing nothing about the Russian boogeyman. Biden won, and I'm just hearing nothing. I mean, we're safe again. The threat has been neutralized. Obviously, I'm joking, but it just, Biden wins, the Democrats won, so Russia is no longer a threat.
Yeah, isn't that amazing that we don't hear about Russian troll farms and Russian Facebook ads really swaying voters and infiltrating Black Lives Matter and different activist groups and stuff like that to try to like swing the election. I mean, it was just the most disgusting narrative pushed out there, and it was used for 4 years to try to usurp like Trump, and all it did was help him. It really, really helped him, because I think a lot of people just didn't understand why the Democrats were doing this and why they were trying to paint Trump as some sort of like Russian spy. There was never any evidence behind it. There was a million other crimes that he was committing that they could have gotten him on. And so it was just a disgrace at the end of the day that amounted to nothing except further distrust in like the corporate media establishment, which then just allowed this siphoning from the Trump camp into like the fake news narrative, right? That everything that the corporate media was saying, even if it was true about his administration, was fake news. And so it really bit them in the ass at the end of the day. And it's curiously absent from the discourse now, right? Just like the voter fraud narrative was curiously absent back in 2016 when Trump won. I didn't hear anyone saying it was a rigged election then. So it's just these narratives only are pushed out there when they serve different factions of the establishment. And it's just all partisan nonsense. And I'm sure this isn't the last we're going to hear about Russia. I'm sure Biden, like he said, he wants to punish Putin. I don't know what that means. Trump was already putting a ton of sanctions on Russia during his administration. He was not easy on Russia at all. So I just fear what will happen next, because I believe in diplomacy and I believe in working relationships with countries around the world, especially in the time of a global pandemic. So it worries me when I hear rhetoric such as what Biden's talking about.
And what I think also is it's kind of dangerous because with Trump, you got the reflexive, fake news to anything critical, whatever. And people were brainwashed by that. And literally, I've gone around the country. I mean, Trump supporters think none of it's true. Not one story is true. But Biden and the Democrats started doing that in a different way, just screaming Russian disinformation when there were negative stories. I mean, the Hunter Biden thing, there's legitimately questions whether Joe Biden met with a Burisma executive and then, tried to get a prosecutor fired. But he just kept screaming Russian disinformation. And then the corporate media did his bidding, regurgitating the same lines. So if more were to come out about Hunter Biden or any role with Joe Biden or anything having to do with corruption, it seems to me the Democrats' line now and Biden's new line is this is a Russian disinformation campaign.
Exactly. Joe Biden was so embarrassing because he was asked about this several times on the campaign trail. And one of the times that he was asked about this, I think we talked about this on the podcast, Jordan, he literally said, like, listen, fats, to an overweight man, and said, like, I'm not sedentary, like challenging him to a push-up contest. I mean, it was batshit crazy. Like the fact that this guy just simply talked about potential corruption with Hunter Biden, which of course existed. Why would Hunter Biden be making $50,000 a month sitting on Burisma? He had no experience. It was clearly a quid pro quo with the VP at the time, like obvious, right? And the fact that Joe Biden like wasn't coached, and of course he was, right? But that just shows you like how off the rails he was. Like he should have been coached over and over again, saying like, answer this in a really diplomatic way. Like people are going to confront you about this, Joe. Like this is a huge issue. And this is like all the Republicans are making, they tried to do a Pizzagate style, Podesta leaks on him right before the election. It was supposed to be their October surprise. It failed, right? But it could still come up. It could still come up, and I think it will come up. And Joe Biden needs to understand how to discuss this, like in a rational way, and needs to respond to this. And the fact that he just shut down any criticism, calling it a Russian disinformation campaign, is just like offensive. It's offensive because we all understand that it's not. Like it exists, the leaks are real, and you need to address this, Biden. So yeah, they're going to keep using that boogeyman, and they're not going to stop. And it's a disgrace, Jordan, because it just shows you the Democrats have learned nothing, right? This is like the party that's just such a sick, sad joke. They continue to just shoot themselves in the foot. They learn nothing from their mistakes, and they're just going to pave the way for a second, fascist takeover, because they can't ever hold themselves accountable.
And I love your thoughts because obviously Obama, when he got in, immediately, we're not looking backwards. We don't want to investigate, no charges, or looking into Bush or his war criminals that pushed Iraq. And now you're hearing Biden, before he gets inaugurated, starting to talk about, I think investigations into Trump would be, divisive, and we need to look forward. I mean, listen, I don't think Trump is on par with, the Iraq war. His crimes were most, money laundering and things like that. But, I think he could be prosecuted for child separation and several other terrible things. But it kind of, it's one of those things, like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. It seems like if every incoming president basically pardons or shields the previous president's crimes, then why would the president, obey the law?
Yeah, Trump's not going to be prosecuted for anything. And that's what's so funny. People keep speculating like, oh, Trump's going to be held accountable. His family's going to go to jail. It's like, are you crazy? Like, why on earth would you think that the Democrats would do this? Biden's entire presidential campaign has been on restoring the character and soul of America. Completely meaningless platitudes that have no application of policy, nothing directing toward lifting the millions that are suffering in poverty in this country, millions who have lost their healthcare and jobs during the pandemic. There is absolutely nothing that is speaking to those people. It is just bizarre, like Pete Buttigieg style rhetoric that's saying like, this is about one America, right? We're gonna join together and not be divided anymore. It's like, all right, man, like that's really all you're running on. And that really was what he was running on, was just that he wasn't Trump. So no one's going to be prosecuted from the Trump administration. if they wanted to prosecute Trump on something, there was so many emoluments clause things that he was violating from the very beginning. Like, he shouldn't even have been qualified to run as a presidential contender. So the fact that he was president for 4 years, profiting tremendously off of his name with all of the government officials that he was meeting with around the world and raking in millions of dollars for his family, none of that is going to ever see the light of day in terms of accountability. Just like how Nancy Pelosi just got re-elected to run the Democratic leadership. It just reminds me, Jordan, when I really was taken aback back during 2006, I think, when she said impeachment was off the table for George W. Bush. And because Obama had that mantra of looking forward, not backward, that is why we're in the situation that we're in today, because we never held the Bush administration accountable for their war crimes, for killing 1 million Iraqis in the Middle East, for torture. We are in the situation where the neoliberals are just a hollow shell, and the fascists continue to be emboldened. And that's where we're going to go. We're just going to keep seeing this divide widen and widen, because there's never any accountability and there's never any introspection on how they can actually build a party that represents the working class. And so we're going to keep seeing people sit the elections out. And as much as we hear about people of color really winning this election for Joe Biden, which I'm sure that there were a lot of people of color who mobilized in really great ways to unseat the threat from the White House, you see cities like Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Chicago, that actually less people in general voted for Biden than they did Hillary Clinton. And you see majority Black rural areas across the Bible Belt that voted for Clinton more than they did Biden. So you really have to look at the complexities of the electoral arena and understand that there's a lot that we don't understand with these sexy narratives that are being pushed out by the mainstream. And they really need to be taken a look at, because things are just going to get worse. And when you have such a huge block that just doesn't engage at all, I fear what's next, Jordan, when the pandemic is just going to keep going on and on with no end in sight.
Can I throw you a curveball here? Because we've talked about this before. Progressive media and media in general, it seems like something has happened in the progressive media that if you dare ever cover Trump's corruption, if you dare ever talk about anything other than the Democratic Party's corruption, there's this new narrative that you're a sellout and, you know, all these things. And it's like, all we should focus on is the Democratic Party corruption, ignore, you know, Republican treachery, ignore, you know, anything having to do with the Republicans. And I just find that kind of dangerous for intellectual thought, because, yeah, the Democrats are bad. We've both covered it. But it seems to me there's something that's been brewing in our circles that if you don't agree 100% or you're not as fire-breathing as I am, you're a sellout.
It has been the most perplexing thing about the Trump administration and era, Jordan. I have really been disappointed with a lot of our colleagues. I think a lot of people have lost the plot because they didn't know where to go, right? When Trump took office and you had the mainstream media in lockstep really, really hammering him on a lot of stuff that was relevant, right? Of course, not foreign policy. We know a lot of these people believe in American exceptionalism and the bipartisan foreign policy agenda, but a lot of the things that Trump was doing, the mainstream media suddenly started caring, even if they were an exacerbation and continuation of the Obama administration. It doesn't mean that they weren't relevant issues, but there was this reflexive contrarianism with a lot of people in the alternative media circles that just simply were revolted, and understandably so, by the corporate media, but simply kind of turned the Trump administration into the enemy of the enemy is my friend, almost ended up apologizing and excusing a lot of the Trump administration. I call it Obama derangement syndrome. Actually, a lot of people said that I had Trump derangement syndrome, but I think it's ODS. You know, a lot of people could not talk about Trump's crimes without saying, well, what about Obama? Well, Obama did it first. It's like, okay, Obama, yeah, oversaw a killer drone empire. Trump quadrupled drone strikes. I cared about drone strikes then. I care about people being killed under drone strikes now. Do you? Like, did you stop caring about it? So really, every single facet of Trump's administration, whether it was the foreign policy angle, which was ramping up militarism, you saw the excuses that he was actually anti-war from these people, or like the policies, you know, the immigrant policies, the Muslim ban, all of these things just seemed to go by the wayside, and people really just kept talking about how Obama did it first. Sure, but what Trump is doing is fucking horrible and abysmal. And as a leftist and as a progressive, I am disgusted and repulsed by the Trump administration, by the evangelical takeover, by Mike Pence, right? By the anti-gay, like conversion therapy passed. I mean, all of these things are pretty horrific, right? And fly in the face of any sort of progressivism whatsoever. So I think because you have you can understand like a structural analysis of why corporate media is bad, but it shouldn't make you lose sight of why the Trump administration is also horrible, right? And you can understand, yes, the Democratic Party and the neoliberal establishment paved the way for Trump. We can completely understand that. We've been covering it. I know that you were primarily covering it at TYT, right, under the Obama administration. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't understand that Trump is a cancerous tumor outgrowth of the failures of the Democratic Party. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can analyze both. And I just never understood why people weren't doing that. And I found it really disheartening and disconcerting. So with Empire Files for the past 4 years, we specifically were targeting to debunk all of this bizarre kind of contrarianism with the Trump administration, and really tried to zero in on what I felt like was lacking with alternative media and corporate media alike, which was, what is Trump actually doing in the foreign policy realm? How is he destroying the planet? And we shouldn't let him off the hook for that, regardless of what he tweets.
And lastly, circling back to Israel, Palestine, and your lawsuit, it shouldn't escape us. I mean, you know better than I. Gaza is, I think, the most densely populated area in the world, and there's a pandemic. And obviously, Israel and its inhumane responses and attacks on Gaza. But can you kind of talk about, I mean, you've reported there, what are they experiencing right now during this pandemic? They're already so poor, so vulnerable, and then you add on a pandemic to it.
Right. I mean, this is an issue that we covered in our film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. People can check it out on Vimeo. It was a collaboration with journalists on the ground that covered the Great March of Return. This was sparked off by Trump moving the embassy, which was a really big blow symbolically to Palestinian sovereignty and independence and the liberation struggle as a whole. But, you know, what people in Gaza are facing is an open air prison. There's 2 million people living there. 75% of them are refugees. The vast majority of them are children. And they are relentlessly bombed and starved. They are put under siege, a medieval siege that Israeli officials have actually talked in the past about counting calories, right, to put them like on the precipice of starvation. They have no clean water. There will be no clean water. I think the UN actually said that at the end of this year, they will have no more clean water. So the vast majority of diseases there are because of bacteria and poisoned waters, essentially. So there's so many different crises that have led to them trying to organize, mobilize, which is where you saw the Great March of Return spark off, and try to mount that international pressure to really call attention to their struggle and their plight there. But this is an absolutely abysmal situation. I think it's one of the most catastrophic human rights crises of our time. And it goes back to this impunity for Israel that, you know, it's somehow justified, right? And everyone is painted as a Hamas target and a justifiable target in Israel. And every time Israel goes on some sort of bombing campaign and kills 500 children like they did in 2014, it's just seen as, well, Hamas is there. Hamas was elected back, 15 years ago. So therefore, they can just relentlessly bomb this area and target kids and bomb hospitals and UN refugee shelters. And it's just absolutely disgusting, Jordan. And what Trump did was actually pull the rug out under the UNRWA funding, which was giving basic human needs like medical equipment and food staples and stuff for a lot of the Gaza refugees. And he just pulled out that funding for them. So they are in a really, really dire place. They have very little access to medical equipment. So when we're talking about COVID, the people who I worked with in the Gaza Fights for Freedom film send me stories every day about how COVID is getting worse. They are trying to contain it as best they can, but there is more cases every single day. And the fact that they have very few ventilators and lacking access to medical equipment, and they are blocked by both borders, right? Israel is partnering with the Egyptian authorities to block their access to Egypt. And of course, they can't get through, and they keep tightening the border year after year as punishment. They can't get through to Israel for treatment. So we are seeing a slow death. And a lot of the people there just think that, that it's basically just collective punishment, and it's a war crime, and it's just flies in direct violation of crimes against humanity. And you can go on and on about how outrageous it is. And unless we mount the pressure here in the U.S. and pressure our politicians to stop allowing Israel to do this, and we really have to call to lift the siege, because COVID is going to explode. The fact that it hasn't already is a miracle. And my friends and colleagues there are very, very worried about how bad it's going to get, and very worried about their lack of access to the treatment that they need to deal with it.
And everyone should check out your documentary, Gaza Fights for Freedom. It was brilliant. Thanks for your hard work. So where could people find out more about your lawsuit and, of course, Empire Files?
So you can go to our YouTube, Empire Files, subscribe. We have our original press conference there, and we have the update with our lawyer. And we'll find out soon. COVID's jammed up the process, but we're waiting for a response from Georgia to see what they're going to do with the lawsuit, especially now that these organizations have filed on in their support. So check out Empire Files, subscribe, and go to our website, theempirefiles.tv. Thank you so much, Jordan, for your time, and thanks for covering this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks so much.